Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. It's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. And today we're going to talk a little bit different, a shift. Instead of talking about battles and death and destruction, we're going to talk about the home front and mention a couple things attributing to World War II, taken from the eyes and vantage point of civilians. So, um, still talking about World War II, so let's get into it. Share my screen. All right, there you go. Home front and civilians. Chapter 12, Lesson 3. Oh, we're moving through this unit, and shortly it'll be over. Um, so let's get into it. Chapter 12, Lesson 3. All right, that was your warm up. Okay, objectives. We're going to understand the ways in which countries mobilize civilians for the war effort. There are different strategies used for the four major countries that we're going to take a look at. And, you can assume same thing happened for the other countries as well, just different ways. All right, so the four nations of mobilization. First, you got the Soviet Union. Um, Even more so than World War One, World War Two was a total war of as fighting was much more widespread and covered most of the world. Um, Clearly seen in the maps we've done in class. Economic mobilization was more extensive, so too was the mobilization of women. The number of civilians killed, almost 20 million, was far higher than those killed in World War One, and most of the victims were children. World War II had an enormous impact on civilian life of the Soviet Union, United States, Japan, and Germany. And those are the four that we're going to look at today. And these mobilization efforts are on these different fronts had greatly affected the outcome of the war. And that's why we're talking about it. So, known to the Soviets as the Great Patriotic War or the German Soviet War, witnessed the greatest land battles in history as well as incredible ruthlessness as discussed before, the sieges of Leningrad, Moscow, Stalingrad, a lot of deaths. Soviet Union, the world's largest country. I mean, it's going to have a lot of deaths. So the initial military defeat suffered by the Soviet Union led to drastic emergency measures that affected the lives of the civilian population. City of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, experienced 900 days of siege. Okay, 900 days. There are 365 days in a year, so that's a little less than 3 years. The whole city was being sieged. Its inhabitants became so desperate for food they even ate dogs, cats, and mice. There are stories where it is well, it was I don't know if it was a myth, but it was common knowledge that wallpaper was mixed in with potato flour. Um, the things that made wallpaper, they used potato flour. So people in their time of need peeled off wallpaper and boiled it in water so they can extract the flour and try and make potatoes from it. 1.5 million people will die in the city over the siege. As the German army made its rapid advance in Soviet territory, Soviet workers dismantled and shipped the factories in the western part of the interior to the Ural Mountains, Western Siberia, and the Volga regions. Machines were placed on the ground as laborers began the work and walls went up around them. As they retreated back east, they brought the industrialization with them. And remember, Soviet Union was slow to industrialize, so the fact that they're able to do this is kind of crazy. All right, more mobilized. So Stalin called for the widespread military and industrial mobilization of a nation and called it the Battle of Machines. The Soviets won, producing 78,000 tanks and 98,000 artillery pieces. In 1943, 55% of the Soviet national income went for war materials, compared with 15% just in 1940. Again, communism. Stalin doing it a little bit better than Lenin, you could say. As a result of the emphasis on military goods, Soviet citizens experienced severe shortages of both food and housing. So there are pitfalls. While it does sound great that they made all these things, the citizens suffered. Soviet women also played a major role in the war effort. Women and girls worked in industries, mines, railroads. Overall, the number of women working in industry increased to almost 60%. Soviet women were also expected to dig anti tank ditches and to work as air raid wardens. The Soviet Union was also the only country in World War II to use women in battle. Only. They used women. Only this country. That's pretty cool. Soviet women served as snipers in air crews and in air crews of bomber squadrons. Like that's awesome. Why couldn't the US do that? Or any other country? So here's some mobilization pictures I found. Again, I don't know if this is from the Soviet Union, but let's just assume so. Women, Soviet women in the army. All right, US mobilized. Okay, so you will get this a lot more in detail next year. But here's a little snippet of what you will learn about. So the home front is another section talked about in U.S. history. Of course, it was a big part here in America. Um, it was very different from other major powers. The U.S. wasn't fighting on its own territory, so eventually the U.S. would become the arsenal of the Allied powers, much like in World War One, as it produced much of the military equipment the Allies needed. Height of the war production came in 1943, and at that point the country was building ships, 6 ships a day, and 96,000 planes in a year. FDR said in a speech emphasizing total war and mobilization as a part of U.S. aims and strategies. The mobilization of the American economy and workforce resulted in some social turmoil, however. Remember, we are still in the days of segregation. The construction of new factories created boom towns where thousands of workers came to work, but then faced shortages of housing and schools. 16 million men and women were enrolled in the military and moved frequently, and another 16 million, mostly wives and girlfriends of servicemen and workers looking for jobs, also moved around the country. And more than 1 million African Americans I just so you know, I took a music class in college called African American Music, and it was abbreviated AFAM. So when you see AFAM, just know I'm talking about African Americans. They will move from the rural south to cities in the north and west looking for jobs and industries. And this is actually called the Second Great Migration. The First Great Migration also happened during World War I, where Southerners moved north to the industrial towns in the north to, work and have jobs. And then now, as the country expanded since then, and more industry are out west, this is where African Americans will move, majorly speaking, and it's called the Second Great Migration. Although the Great Migration can be constituted from 1914 to 1970. There you go. The Great Migration. Need to know it. The presence of African Americans in areas which they had not lived before will lead to racial tensions and sometimes even racial riots. Detroit, June 1943, white mobs roamed the city streets attacking African Americans. 1 million African Americans actually joined the U.S. military, where they served in segregated units, and for some, this treatment will lead to their fight for civil rights. Japanese Americans on the West Coast faced even some more serious issues. Over 110,000 Japanese Americans living on the West Coast, 65% born in America. They're called Nisei. Their parents who immigrated from Japan are called Issei. These guys are called Nisei. They are removed into internment camps surrounded by barbed wire and were required to take loyalty oaths. It's called the Japanese internment. It's getting brought to light more and more nowadays. So got to talk about it. And again, you'll get more of this information next year. But the Japanese internment, not a good thing for Americans. Again, while it is horrible to think about, you got to think back to, misogynistic America back in the day. They were attacked by Japan and they thought sabotage was going to happen and occur within our country on the West Coast, and they didn't want that to happen. So they forcefully removed over 110,000 Japanese Americans. Was it racist? Yes. And people are still suffering from that. Um, Public officials claim that the policy was necessary for security reasons like suspected espionage or sabotage, even though no information came from that. Not a single lick of evidence came from that. Here's some airplanes, U.S. production, Rosie the Riveter, we can do it. Plant a victory garden, our food is for fighting. Second Great Migration, 1940 to 1970. Again, moving from the South, Seattle, Portland, Oakland. Oakland was a big shipbuilding area. Obviously, Los Angeles. Here are African American workers. Here is pictures of African American race riots. Again, not good. If you've ever seen the movie Red Tails, it's about these African Americans at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, where it was solely for African Americans in the Air Force, and they played a part in the war effort in Europe. There's the movie clip. And then this is posters of Japanese internment. 1942, April, December 7, 1941, we were attacked. April 1942, this happens. Executive Order 9066. Again, you can make comparisons that it looks like a concentration camp. I'm just saying. So this was the exclusion zone and all the different areas. Hey, look, a key, a map. And it's not to say that only Japanese were moved. It is also some Italians and German Americans were also placed in internment camps all along the East Coast as well. All right, Germany mobilized. So in 1914, Germans had enthusiastically cheered their soldiers marching off to war, and in September 1939, the streets were quiet, and many in the Nazi regime feared disaster. Hitler was well aware of the importance of the home front, as he believed that the collapse of the home front in World War I caused Germany's defeat. Not the Jews, though, right? To avoid repetition of that experience, he adopted economic policies that may actually have cost Germany the war. To maintain the morale of the home front during the first 2 years of the war, Hitler refused to cut consumer goods production or to increase the production of arms. Think about that as I explain some more. The Blitzkrieg actually gave Germans quick victories and enabled them to plunder the food and raw materials of conquered countries. This way, Germany could avoid taking away resources from the civilian economy. Tried to do it both ways. After German defeats on the Russian front and the American entry into the war, the economic situation in Germany changed, not for the good. Early in 1942, Hitler ordered a massive increase in arms production and the size of the army. Hitler's architect, Albert Speer, was made Minister of Armaments and Ammunitions in 1942, and Speer was able to triple the production from 1942 to 1943 in spite of all the Allied air raids. A total mobilization of the economy was put into effect July 1944. They had been fighting for 5 years, almost 5 years to the day, and they just put that into effect. And that seems too late for good old Hitler over here. Schools, theaters, and cafes were closed, but by that time, total war mobilization was too late to save Germany from defeat. You either got to go all in or not in at all. And he tried to do both, and it didn't work out for him. Nazi attitudes towards women also changed during the course of the war. Before the war, Nazis had worked to keep the women out of the job market as the war progressed and more men were called up for military service. The position no longer made sense. In spite of change, the number of women working in industry, agriculture, and commerce and domestic service only increased slightly. The total number of women employed in September 1944 was 14.9 million compared to 14.6 million in May 1939. So not that much. Many of those belonged to the middle class who did not want jobs, particularly in factories. So that's Hitler trying to make plans and botch them. Yeah, I don't speak German, but Deutschland means Germany. Japan mobilized. So wartime, Japan was highly mobilized society to guarantee its control over national resources. The government created a planning board to control prices, wages, labor, and resources. Kind of like what happened here in America. Traditional habits of obedience and hierarchy were used to encourage citizens to sacrifice their resources, sometimes their lives, for the national cause. The calls for sacrifice reached a high point in the final years of the war. Young Japanese men were encouraged to volunteer to serve as pilots on suicide missions against the U.S. fighting ships at sea, and they're known as kamikaze pilots, or in Japanese, divine wind, kamikaze, divine wind. And that's going to be a problem. So let's cause as much destruction, but instead of causing destruction and surviving, you're going to waste a plane and a pilot. Japan was reluctant to mobilize women on behalf of Japan's war effort. General Hideki Tojo, prime minister, opposed female employment altogether. Female employment, however, increased during the war, but only in areas such as textiles and farming, which were the traditional jobs they worked. Instead of using women to meet labor shortages, the Japanese actually brought in Korean and Chinese laborers to fight for them, and not use women, or not fight, to work, to work, to work, to work. That's Tojo. That's a plane. These are pictures. You Google kamikaze, and that is what you see, this photo. And here's a pilot. I think there's a freeze frame from a video, and they're about to commit suicide, forcing their plane, crashing their plane into ships. And that is where America gets the notion that, Japan isn't going to surrender. They are killing themselves trying to defeat us. Japan will not surrender. Okay, city bomber. Bombing was used in World War II against military targets, enemy troops, and civilian populations. Bombings made the home front a very dangerous place. Although bombing raids had been conducted in the last years of World War I, the aircraft at the time were limited by how far they could fly and how much they could carry. The bombings of civilians actually led to public outcry, and many political leaders believed that bombing civilian populations would force governments to make peace. As a result, European air forces began to develop long-range bombers that carried enormous payloads in the 1930s. British bombing. So the first country using that sustained the use of civilian bombing began in 1940. We talked about this already. Londoners took their first heavy blows, and for months, the German Air Force bombed London nightly. Thousands of civilians were killed, injured, and enormous damage was done to the buildings of London. In spite of their extensive damage done to the lives of property, Londoners' morale remained high. Remember, keep calm and carry on. The Blitz, as the British called the German air raid, soon became a national experience. The Blitz was carried out to many other British cities and towns, not just London, as I showed in the map in the previous lectures. The ability of Londoners to maintain their morale set the standard for the rest of the British population. This theory that the bombing of civilians would force peace was actually proved wrong. Many children were actually evacuated from the cities during the war to avoid the bombing. That is a good, smart part by Winston Churchill and whoever thought of that. Evacuate the children, move them to the countryside, and take their mothers with them. Smart move. Some British parents will try and send their children to Canada or the United States, but that proved just as dangerous, such as an example of the Arendora Star. It was a British ocean liner that was hit by a German torpedo and had 77 children aboard, and they never made it to Canada. Sad story. But here you got a woman after the bombings. Keep calm, drink some tea. Here you got a milkman. Keep calm, carry on with your day. Make it seem like it is. Okay, here's the dark areas were the areas that were bombed. There's the Arendora Star. I couldn't find the destruction pictures. All right, German bombing. So the British failed to learn from their own experience because they said, if you bomb us, we bomb you. Churchill and his advisors believed that destroying German communities would break the civilian morale and bring victory. Major bombing air raids conducted on German cities began in 1942 and May 1930 first. May 31st, 1942, Cologne became the first German city to be attacked by over 1,000 bombers. Bombing raids added to the element of terror in the dire circumstances by growing shortages of food, clothing, and fuel. Germans, too, sought to protect their children from bombings by evacuating them from the cities. Smart. They had a program and created 9,000 camps for children in the countryside. A lot of camps being built. Especially fearful to the Germans were the incendiary bombs that created firestorms that swept through the cities. The ferocious bombing of Dresden, February 13th to 15th, 1945, created a firestorm that may have killed as many as 35,000 inhabitants and refugees. Germany suffered enormously from the Allied bombing raids. Millions of buildings were destroyed and 500,000 civilians died. Nevertheless, it is highly unlikely that the Allied bombing sapped German morale. Instead, the Germans, whether pro Nazi or anti Nazi, fought on stubbornly, often driven by the simple desire just to live. At times, even young people were expected to fight in the war. For example, during the last few years of the war, Hitler youth members, 14 and 15-year-olds, served on the front lines. What a guy that guy Hitler is, man. Putting your children, your future on the front lines. The bombings did not destroy Germany's industrial capacity either. Production of war materials actually increased during 1942 and 1944 in spite of the bombings. However, widespread destruction of transportation systems and fuel supplies made it extremely difficult for these new materials to reach the German military. Here's the Hitler Youth. Here you got youth German soldiers getting awarded. Destruction. This is not Dresden. I think this is Cologne. This is Dresden. As you can tell by the fire. I think this is also Dresden. Destruction afterwards. A lot of bombs. This is the Royal Air Force in America. A lot of bombs being dropped on Germany in tonnage. So 914,000 tons, double that. That's 1.8 million tons dropped on, or pounds, 1.8 million pounds dropped on Germany. 1944 alone. If you're talking about bombings, you also gotta talk about Japan. Japan was open to air raids towards the end of the war because its air force had almost been destroyed since like the Battle of Midway. Moreover, its crowded cities were built of flimsy materials, especially vulnerable to fires. Attacks on Japanese cities were used by the new B-29 Superfortress airplanes by the United States, the biggest bombers in the war. And that started November 24th, 1944. The summer of 1945, many of Japan's industries had been destroyed, with 1/4 being its dwellings, houses. To add to the strength of the military, Japanese government decreed mobilization of all people between the ages of 13 and 60 to join the volunteer corps. In Japan, the bombing of civilians reached a new level with the use of the first atomic bomb. Spoiler alert. Fearing high U.S. casualties and a land invasion of Japan, President Truman and his advisors decided to drop the atomic bombs of 1945. The result were thousands of deaths of Japanese civilians. And cue in all you Oppenheimer fanatics if you watch that movie. This is the B-29 Super Fortress. And this is how big it actually looks. This is just a normal plane, right? These are normal sized people, and that's a big plane. That's some bombings. I think that's Tokyo, another city. When you look up bombings, you obviously get Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which, yes, are important. But you know, when you're looking at all these pictures, these are all the cities that were bombed. There you go. This map of Japan shows the principal industrial cities which were burned out. The figures indicate what part of the coat of the city was destroyed. For comparison, each city is paired with a U.S. city. That's weird. And then those are the little boy fat man bombs that went off. And that's it. A little bit long. I talked a little bit faster, but you know, you need to do it. So that's the end of the lecture. Your homework is page 462, 2 through 4. 462, 2 through 4. Yeah, and so that was the home front. Some information we've already talked about, some we're about to talk about, and even as you saw at the end, we're going to talk about the Holocaust in the next lecture. So, um, World War II, moving along. So, yeah. Hopefully you guys did enjoy that. I know death and bombings isn't all that fun to talk about. So you're okay. Anyway, hope you guys did enjoy that. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Burst.